Good evening and greetings from Sahitya Sarovar. I welcome you in this series of talk show Vaktavya. It is the seventh episode of this talk show, and it's really an honor and pleasure to have one of the most prominent Indian poets in conversation with us today. Today, we are in conversation with Ma'am Arundhathi Subramaniam. Good evening,
I'm
ma'am.
glad I can be seen. Good evening, Uday. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much for joining, and thank you for agreeing this for this conversation. It really mean for a lot for us.
I'm delighted to be here, and particularly a conversation around books, Uday. As I told you just a little while ago, it's something that makes me feel very optimistic about about another generation.
Yes, ma'am. No, it's an honor for me and for my listeners too. So we'll begin with first of all with one of your poems, which I have read for the first time. That was 5.4 oblique Andheri local. So, in that poem, you describes various aspects or point of view of women. So, what was the central idea or the thing that you want to convey through that poem?
So 546 Andheri Local is a poem actually from my very first book. So it was written a very long time ago, Uday. It was written sometime in the 1990s. And So it's interesting to revisit a poem that old. I think that essentially what I remember of it. It's a short poem, and it talks about the absolutely matchless experience of traveling on a peak hour Bombay local train, which is a crazy experience. It's not a forgettable experience either. I did it for many years, and it starts with a sense of feeling completely hemmed in, completely claustrophobic, besieged by the dense congestion of that experience, all these bodies packed in. And yet, in a fairly short poem, that experience changes. That I think is why I probably put it into that first book. Because it starts with a sense of being besieged, it then moves into a feeling of empowerment, where this great, dense conglomeration of women suddenly becomes one large entity. And so there's the image of the million tongued, multi spoused Kali on wheels. So there's an image of power, an image of strength. And then finally, there's a kind of dark humor at the end. So I think it's the fact that that the poem shifts from women who are more acted upon than acting, and then moves on to the sense of women of power, and then the playfulness of the end. I think that's probably why I stand by the poem even today.
Yeah, no, it was a very great poem and full of you can say pictures and metaphors. So, I would next question is mine that your poems meditates between home and world. What was the central idea that you want to convey through them?
Through 546 Andheri Local or the rest of
No,
my
your
work.
poems, your other poems which used to meditate between the home and the world.
Yeah, well, I'd say, I suspect that the poem at the back of your mind is a poem called Home, which is where I speak of, I say, give me a home that isn't mine. But then the poem moves out to actually talk of a wider context. What do I really want to say? I think what I always have believed, Uday, that every time I'm writing a poem, I'm writing something that for me is new. So it's not like I always know what I want to say as much as I'm discovering it through the poem. But if I were to go back to the central line of Home, that particular poem, which then gave rise to an entire book called Where I Live, I think what I was exploring was the gap between where I live and where I belong. Sometimes I'm not quite sure of where I belong, but I am very clearly know where I don't belong. So the poems, in some way, were returning to explore that gap. And the other thing that has always fascinated me, and I believe this set of poems anticipated that, is the notion of travel, of quest, seeking, journeying. These are ideas and images that keep coming through the poems, and in many ways, they've been part of my life as well. So the sense of the deep desire for to be surprised by the unexpected, and at the same time the deep desire for the familiar. This tension between familiar and unfamiliar. I think this is very much there at the heart of my poetry, and perhaps at the heart of what I look for. You know, if I were to ask you, or if you were to ask me what I consider to be a good poem, I'd say it's always one in which there is the sense of something that's achingly familiar, but also something that's surprising. And I think that's what I've always looked for in life and in art. You know, that sense of adventure and anchorage at the same time.
Yes. I want to talk about something about your childhood too. Please describe about your childhood and were you a poet as a child too? And I have heard about your poem that you wrote at the age of 18 or 19, if I'm not wrong, Amoeba. And
Yeah.
also you wrote at the two stories at the age of 10 and 12. Please tell about them also and about your childhood.
Well, I grew up in Bombay or Mumbai, which is a challenging city, Uday. Have you been there?
No,
Have you
ma'am.
ever? No.
No.
It's a crazy city. It's a city um, I've always wanted to get the hell out of, but I keep getting nostalgic about it as well. So that's where I grew up. And looking back, I think it was chaotic and exciting all at once because it's a city of many cultures, many languages. It's a truly cosmopolitan city. So I grew up to parents who were readers. I had a house full of books. I grew up in an apartment full of books. I grew up with an elder sister who was also an omnivorous reader. So, books and conversations around books and fantasy worlds were an integral part of my life. And you know, when you talk of school and your library, it takes me back to my library at home, but also in school, which is where I spent a good deal of my time. And yes, I wrote. I think that as soon as I could write, I started writing stories, poems, or what I thought were poems, but were actually dreadful little bits of verse. But that was part of my excitement about language, I think. And around the age of 12 or 13, no, much earlier than that, probably at the age of 10, I remember writing a poem about a little chicken in a farmyard, which is the one I think you were referring to. The chick in the farmyard in that particular story was deeply disturbed. There were two major themes in that story. The chick was deeply disturbed by the violence and the brutality of the world around her. And the chick was also deeply disturbed by the feeling, or disquieted, by the sense of being hemmed in, the claustrophobia of that farmyard. So, looking back now, I realize that these were important ideas running through my head. They were what concerned me as a child: loss, pain, that bothered me, grief, you know, what it would mean to lose the ones you loved, what it meant to live in what seemed to be a completely random and crazy world, and this idea of a loss of freedom, the sense of wanting to explore, but not having quite been able to spread my wings. So I think that was there in the chick story. I wrote it later, later, I wrote a story about a cloud, where again, I think the themes were freedom, what it meant to be, um, and also what it really meant to be me. What was this life about? I think that question was always there, and it probably led much later to my spiritual journey. You know, basic existential questions of who am I and what is this life journey about? I think that was quite strong, and it was there in that particular story because the question was really who is this cloud? What is this cloud? Is it thing or is it vapor? And the whole story started from there. So, looking back now, I realize that these were themes that were probably present in my work decades ago, and I suspect they haven't gone away. So, my childhood was one of a a very active inner world where I was constantly dreaming and um, creating fantasy worlds and stories and poems for myself. Thankfully, I had a sister I could share some of that with. But my outer world was, that of a regular schoolgirl trying to fit in and never quite fitting in. That was my story outside. Inside, it was a rich, exciting world.
Yes. No, it's very relatable going to the libraries, books, and writing the poems. So,
Yeah.
Will, I want to ask that a curiosity because you are a very famous poet. So, which writers or poets you used to read in your childhood?
In my childhood. Hmm. Many poets, I think, but I'm trying to think of those who left a deep impression on me. Uday, there was, you mentioned Keats earlier. Keats was certainly someone I read as a child, when I was say 10 or 11, and I remember being very excited but not quite sure, what was happening. But later in my life, maybe 2 or 3 years later, when I was 12 or 13, let's say, when I started reading, I remember this moment when I first read T.S. Eliot. And I mention this because he's a modern poet. So a lot of my early days I'd spent reading my books in my father's library, which meant a lot of the romantic poets, that is, Keats and Byron and Shelley and Wordsworth and Coleridge and of course the later poets like even Tennyson. But it's when I first read T.S. Eliot, a 20th century poet, that I remember feeling a sense of real excitement and homecoming. There was a feeling of mystery, but at the same time, there was something very real, and the idiom was relatable, even when it was very complex. It was a complex poem. He's a complex poet. But I remember a sense of excitement about it. And later on, I read a lot in my teens, I read a lot of the Zen poets, Basho and Issa and Buson. I read a lot of them. And that had a very deep impact on my life because I also had a certain fascination with the existential, the spiritual journey, and so on. So the way in which spirituality and art could come together interested me. And there were many others, whose names don't come to mind right now. But I think I started getting very interested when I read contemporary poetry. I remember the Illustrated Weekly of India at that time. Pritish Nandir had a page for poetry. And I read many of the contemporary poets at that time, Kamala Das and so on. So you read poets around me. And that was my first realization, Uday, that poets could be living, breathing entities around me in my country and in my city. Because in textbooks at that time, much of the poetry we read ended with Tagore. We didn't go beyond that. But gradually, thankfully, by the time I reached my 10th standard, I realized Nissim Ezekiel was prescribed in my textbook, and then I realized Nissim Ezekiel actually lived in my city. It was a great moment for me when he came to my school and read from his work. That was my first sense of a real living, breathing poet in front of me. It was exciting.
It's no. Taking an interview with you is like that only. So reading from you and now taking an interview. So I
Mhm.
would know. Can I get to know that when you get first published?
Mm. When did I get published?
Yeah.
Well, I published a lot in journals. So from the age of 19 onwards, there were literary journals and so on that I was being published in. But that particular moment in Indian publishing in India was not a great time for poets. If you were an Indian writer in English, you were really expected at that time to be writing a novel because the Indian novel was doing wonderfully. There were some really major names around, some wonderful writers around. But Indian poetry was really given short shrift at that time. Most of the major publishers weren't willing to pick it up. And this was something that made some of us very despondent, but at the same time, I think it was good also. Now, looking back in retrospect, it was good for me because it compelled me to keep working on my poems, keep chiseling and tweaking and gnawing away at the poems. And I was first published as a writer in terms of a book. My first book happened in 2001. So it was, for me, a long wait because I'd been writing through the 90s. And I'd almost felt like, oh my God, this book is never going to happen. But I was doing readings. I was doing a lot of readings. I was being published in journals. That was there. So there was a sense of validation, but the first book happened only in 2001.
Yes. You once said that the decision to write poetry, and it was not a glamorous or a good decision to make. So it is challenging to write Indian English poems when the field is dominating with the prose, as you said also.
Mm. Yeah, it was and continues to be, but perhaps less so now for me because I'm a little more. I'm little more, I'm just more, I'm better known and the work is better known today. But at the start, it was particularly hard, because you were very conscious that even at the time that you were writing, as I was in the 90s and the early 2000s, you're very conscious of the fact that even when you got published, it didn't mean hefty royalty checks, which some of the great Indian novelists were getting. And it never meant any kind of glamour in that respect, you know. So I often used to say, somewhat ironically, that the thing about poetry, and this is a great legacy of the Romantics, is that it helps if you die early. But then of course you're granted your place in the sun. But if you live on to be a middle-aged poet, there's nothing that's as dowdy as that. So, of course, I was being ironic. And I will also say that things did get better, not just for me, but I believe that in the poetry scene in India today, things have gotten a lot better for poets. For one, the internet has happened. And that means that people can be published, people can put their work out there and be read in a way that wasn't possible for us, as young poets. And that's a good thing. It means that in some ways, poetry has been, as an utterance, the spoken word has been democratized. And it's less of a struggle. There are
Yes.
pros and cons, but for now, I'm just talking about the pros. I think the pros are the fact that it's much less difficult today to share your work. The con, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that because I'd like us to move on with our conversation, but the possible problem with this is that there is a particular importance of rigor. That is, you work on your craft hard. You work hard. You sweat a little blood over your poem before putting it out. Um, that was important for me, and I think some of the poets who were working alongside me at the time. Whereas today, I think one of the possible perils is that one can put one's work out too soon, before the poem itself has fully hatched. So that's something to think about too, I think.
Yes. I want to know about the mechanism that you follow while writing a poem. Is it a bit by bit contribution, or you write in one go? Or are you a poet of first draft, or you make changes in your poetry?
Almost always I have multiple drafts. Almost always. 546 Andheri Local, which is a poem you mentioned, was probably the only poem I've written that happened in one draft. But that very seldom happens. And I'm a great believer in revising one's work. So my usual way to do it is to write fragments, later on look at what I've written. Sometimes they're just independent fragments. At other times, I find a fragment here and a fragment there can actually come together and make a poem. So I might actually fuse them. And at still other times, I might just weed out lots of stuff. So what started as a single fragment of, say, 10 lines might just come down to 3. And that's all I will keep in the poem. So there's a lot of pruning that happens as well.
Yes. Here I quote from one of your poems, which is in your collection, When God is a Traveler. A face you can turn outside like a sock. Which is the actual face you are talking about here?
Is it the poem called Refaced? I think it's from a
Yes,
poem
ma'am.
called
The,
Refaced.
the
Yeah.
first poem.
Mm. It's actually a poem that was inspired by a line from an Imtiaz Dharkar poem. And I think the line that I have in my poem is a face that you can turn inside out, like a sock. And my
Yes.
aspiration in that poem was to have such a face. I think what I was pointing to there was the fact that I wanted a face where the division between inner and outer wasn't as intense. I wanted it to be a more blurry divide between the inside and the out. I wanted a face that could reflect my interiority without my having to be afraid or apologetic or just uncomfortable with my own vulnerability. You know, in school, I don't know if you still have this, but we used to have this, especially in our arithmetic books, we used to have a line to separate the rough work from the fair work. Do you still have that?
Yes, ma'am.
You
Yes.
do. So the rough work was in, in the side, and then the fair work was in the middle. What I think I'm pointing to in that line is I wanted the kind of face that allowed me to blur the divide between rough and fair. You know, I didn't want the rough to be the place of just complete chaos and the fair to be immaculate. I wanted that inside and the out, the rough and the fair, to both be shareable. That's an aspiration. I'm not sure I'm anywhere near it, but that was the aspiration of that poem.
Yes. Talking about a poem that is in your in your collection, Love Without a Story, Catabolic Woman. There is a paradox in one of your poems, in the phrase of the poem, which you mention also in some of your interviews, widely Indian, anti-national. What do you mean by this phrase?
Ah, what do you think I mean? So, no. So let me respond to that at very briefly. Actually, "Catabolic Women" is a fun poem, and it's intended to be an energetic, playful, and yet it's supposed to be an anthem. I am definitely speaking out on behalf of women who have nothing more to prove, women who are happy to be themselves and who are happy to not wear various masks and faces uh, to please the world, as it were. So, what do I mean by wildly Indian anti-national? Wildly Indian for me is really what I believe I am and what I believe many of us are, which is, and I don't even think we can define what it means to belong to this culture, this subcontinent, but I know I belong. I don't even know if I can ever define what it means to be Indian, but I know I am. You know, and wherever I am in any part of the world, this is very deeply, culturally home. Spiritually, it is home. So, utterly Indian, that's how I see myself. Anti national, that paradox is intentional because I'm uncomfortable with anyone from the outside prescribing, offering me a prescription or a formula to be Indian. I am Indian as they come, but I am not Indian in some kind of prescriptive way. I don't want to fit into a prescription of Indianness. Indianness is actually so very important to me that I wouldn't want to make the mistake of trying to define it and fit anyone into a pigeonhole. That's how important it is. And I think it points to my deep discomfort, Uday, with any attempt at a dogmatic definition, whether it is on the basis of gender, whether it is on the basis of faith, whether it's on the basis of culture. I don't like dogmatic definitions, but I like multidimensional ways of belonging, you know, whether it is to a faith or a gender or a culture or to a moment in time. So I have it actually reminds me of another poem that I have, which I wrote many years ago in my book, Where I Live. It's a poem called To the Welsh Critic Who Doesn't Find Me Identifiably Indian. So there again, it's a rant of a poem, and it's a rant against not Indian voices who tell you how to belong. It's a rant against Western academic commentators who try to tell you how to belong. I think belonging is something we are all uncovering, discovering all the time. It's not something that can be imposed from without. An identity is something that we are intended to explore. The joy is in exploring and discovering and inventing. And I think it would be a pity if we lost that.
Yes. My next question would I quote your one of your line that you once said that poetry is metaphor for me is the marrow of the poetry. According to you, how important is the metaphor in the poetry, which we often find in your poetry?
Yeah, that's a good question, Uday. I think for me, the image or or metaphor is really the vital part of a poem. It's what makes poetry the form of verbal enchantment. You know, poetry is really the oldest form of literary enchantment on this planet. And I think one of the reasons, the primary reasons for that, are sound, the way in which poetry uses sound and rhythm. And the other aspect of it is image or metaphor. Metaphor is an ability to bring together the abstract and the concrete. And poetry brings these two together and makes them seem inseparable. This is the excitement of poetry for me. And it's the reason why I return to poems again and again. Many people I find, especially writers who are just setting out on, they want to write poetry. I find many of them often tend to feel they must be universal, and then they immediately start looking for grand themes, and they become more and more abstract, often forgetting that along with this great grandeur or universality that we aspire to, there is also the intense physicality, the intense particularity. That is, this moment, this person, this experience. If we are able to tether a poem to this moment, this person, this experience, and at the same time allow it to take wing at the same time, the sense of concreteness and the sense of enormity at the same time, if we're able to bring those together verbally, we have a poem. So I've always found when I write a poem that if I start with an image and allow the image to lead me, it always leads me to a place that surprises even me. And I like to be surprised when I'm writing a poem. And I've also found that the image is also, as I often say, the image is always more intelligent than I am. I might sit down and think, I want to write a poem about this, this, and this. But if I start with an image, the image, and I follow the image and I trust the image always leads me to a place that even I hadn't anticipated. And there is a delight in that, you know?
Yes. Talking some about the present times, the lockdown, the pandemic, you once said also that it was a chance to reboot, and lockdown had given us very much opportunities for quiet meditation and introspection. How had it been for you?
Hmm. It was a disquieting time, Uday, you know. Yes, for me, for many years now, I found ways of keeping my life quiet when I've needed to. I've traveled a lot, but I also have found very, very actively carved out spaces of retreat in my life. So being quiet or leading a more interior life is not new to me. And yet, during the pandemic, when I was compelled to do it, I found it hard. I think I was picking up almost osmotically, I was picking up the deep unease that we were all going through planetarily. And so there was a lot of stuff to process. It was not easy. I wrote one book in that time. It's a book called Women Who Wear Only Themselves. And that was written with a crazy intensity, that particular book. Other than that, I think a lot of my time has actually just been spent trying to make poems, but not pushing the pace. Because in many ways, for me, I believe this time has been one of also watching, not being in a hurry to um, to put work out there. You know, so other than this book of essays, Women Who Wear Only Themselves, I'm not really in a hurry to pursue another project. I feel I have to work my way through this time more intuitively and follow the promptings of my heart, as it were.
Yes, ma'am. Now coming towards your books like Eating God and When Love Without a Story, and When God is a Traveler, I want to know that what was your inspiration behind these wonderful titles, unique titles, and like the metaphor you have used in your book, the woman who wears themselves only wears themselves. Please, could you tell about them?
Well, each poem is, I mean, each book it's been somewhat different, but I'd say in the case of the poems, the like for instance, when God is a traveler, the the title is actually a title of one of the poems in the book. And because I realized when looking at all those poems together, when I was putting the manuscript, assembling the manuscript, I realized that all the poems seem to collectively come back to this notion of journeys and quest. It felt right to use this particular title because it was evocative. And it's also a comment. I mean, I must also say, books talk to one another. So not everyone knows the conversation that's happening, but there is always a conversation that's happening. So for me, that title is also a riff. It's also playing with the idea of another book. It's a book of translations by A.K. Ramanujan and David Shulman and V. Narayana Rao, a book of translations of Telugu poetry called When God is a Customer. So that book was also, that title was somewhere in my mind. So it was also a response to that title. So each book, has its own, the titles of each book have their own stories. Since you ask about the most recent book, which is Love Without a Story is my most recent book of poems. And, but my most recent book, otherwise, is a book of prose, which is Women Who Wear Only Themselves. There again, the title was not something I had any clue about until I actually finished the book. And it was when I was writing the introduction that this line happened to surface in one of the sentences I wrote. I was talking about the kind of women I was interested in this book. And I said, women who wear or seek to wear only themselves. And this suddenly struck me as a resonant phrase. And this is really, in a sense, what the book is about. It's about four completely diverse women. One is a monk, one is a naked woman mystic, one is a woman who wears blue jeans. They actually, physically, are wearing very different they're making very different sartorial choices. And on a deeper level, existentially, they're making very different spiritual choices. So it seemed to fit in. So sometimes you luck out with a title, and I think I lucked out with this one. I wanted to change it actually, but my publisher was emphatic that I'd stay with it. And I'm glad I did.
Yes. All of the books are fabulous. The title attracts the reader to themselves. Now, I would ask a question on your writing, on your experience of writing. That does writing gives a satisfaction, or there is a worry that something is left to be expressed?
Do you feel that when you write?
Yeah, sometimes it comes. Sometimes
Yeah.
it comes.
So there's a lovely line by the poet Paul Valéry. He says that we often, a poem is never completed; it's just abandoned. And I think it speaks to something that all of us have felt. That is, you work hard on a poem, you try to make it live out its destiny, what it wants to say. And then you actually find at the end of it that you at some point have to come to a halt. You have to say, this is it. There's only so much I can do with this poem. There's still so much more I want to say, but maybe that will have to wait for another poem. So there is often a sense of closure, which means there is relief. There is even sometimes a kind of happiness. I think I wouldn't be writing if there wasn't a joy about the process. But there's also that niggling sense that not quite there yet. Not quite there yet.
Yes. While reading your poems have a great variety of topics, and you have written on many topics, spirituality, even on like a poem like Andheri Local, and etc. So I want to know what is the source of variety in your poems.
Source of variety. I think just life itself, Uday. Many people think, oh, you're interested in spirituality means you have to be writing about something, metaphysical and abstruse all the time. I've never seen spirituality that way. For me, my daily life is about it's about all the things that make up human life, isn't it? It's about food, and it's about love, it's about relationships, it's about the cities I've lived in, the experiences I have when I step out of my home, the experiences I have within my home, and then the experiences I have within myself. So all of it in some way is part of the poetic canvas. So I've always said, when people say, "Are you a spiritual poet?" I always say, if spirituality includes uh, writing about, Bombay and Madras and New York and Florence and all the cities of the world, and if spirituality includes writing about love and parents and friends and um, cats and dogs and all of this, then yes, maybe I'm spiritual. But it's really about being human, isn't it? So the human experience is really what offers variety. One doesn't have to try very hard. The only thing I would say is, when I'm writing a poem, I'm often looking for depth. I'm looking to take a particular moment, whatever the moment, and deepen my experience of it. I'm not always trying to widen as much as I'm trying to deepen. And the variety is always there. It's just trying to deepen one's experience of that variety.
Yeah. Now, coming towards our busy life in this contemporary times and contemporary world, I want to know that how do you manage the time and how writing fits in your rest of your life?
Well, I'm now a full time writer, and I have been for more than a decade now. And so I can't really complain that I don't have time to write. But I will say that I don't push it either. Writing is part of my sadhana, it's part of my discipline. And so my laptop is always with me wherever I go, whether I'm in an airport or whether I'm in a station, or whether I'm in a bus stop, or whether I'm in a taxi on my way somewhere. My laptop is my companion. So I make time for writing, but I make time for it not because it's penance, but because it's pleasure. So it's a joy to have it with me. At the same time, I will say, Uday, that I've always been a freelancer. Even I made my living off writing on the arts, freelance writing on the arts and curatorial work that I did. But I've always freelanced. And the reason for that, for me, is that I want my life to be fluid enough to allow me to spend a whole day working on one line in a poem if I want to. And at the same time, I want the freedom to spend a whole day having a bit, or at least half the day, having an intense conversation with someone who matters very deeply to me. I want that freedom. I want a freedom to be able to shut shop and say, I want to go for a very, very long walk today. Or the freedom to say, I'm only going to spend a whole week. Uh, I'm going to spend a whole week writing, or I'm going to spend a whole week focusing on my yoga, or whatever else. I want that measure of freedom. For me, that has meant and I think it's important to say this, it's meant in many ways giving up on a lucrative life. Because, if you want to make pots of money and have a regular job, and nothing wrong with that ambition. But I had to give up on some of that to allow for this freedom. That was a personal choice, and I was willing to make it.
Yes, ma'am. Being a poet, you might have faced the criticisms also.
Mhm.
How would you handle it and how does it affect your writing also?
Mm, there are different kinds of criticism. There is, I used to be part of a writers' group in Bombay as a young poet in my teens and 20s. And we used to offer each other very minute, constructive feedback on poems in the making. And so I often suggest this to younger writers. I say, make sure you're part of a group where you offer each other rigorous feedback. That kind of criticism, workshop criticism, as I call it, is very, very useful. There is another kind of criticism that can end up being what I said earlier, which is a kind of prescriptive criticism, where the tone is legislative. This is what you must do. This is what you should do. This is what you ought to do. I'm always uncomfortable with that tone. So whenever I encounter it, I don't I don't take it terribly seriously whenever I encounter it. There are times it has riled me enough to write a poem. So my poem that I mentioned to you earlier, to the Welsh critic who doesn't find me identifiably Indian, was a response to a poet, to a critic. But I wouldn't necessarily write a poem for every critic. That's an attempt to immortalize the critic, which I wouldn't want to do. But I will say that I write criticism myself. And for me, criticism, writing poetry criticism, literary criticism of any kind, is really about trying to offer a key. You're trying to unlock the mysteries of a text. You're not trying to impose your agenda on it. What you're doing is exploring and sharing with the reader what it is that makes this particular poem work. What are the strategies in this poem? So, when I was a student, I remember first reading a work of criticism on an essay, a literary essay on the work of Shelley on Ode to a West Wind, I think. And it took my breath away because it was the first time I realized you can open up a text in this wonderful way without, you're not being reductive, you're not trying to reduce the text. You're opening it up. You're opening up the whole world that it embodies. That approach to criticism, to me, is actually deeply creative, which is why I believe that the finest criticism is really very creative work. And that's the kind of criticism that speaks to me. It's not prescriptive. It is exploratory.
Yes, ma'am. My next question would be, in this contemporary world, how important the poetry is, how much the poetry matters.
I think poetry matters because it reminds us of the importance of wonder. We need wonder in our lives, I think, there more than ever. Most people have begun to believe that all that happens in the world of the media, in social media, all the yelling and screaming that happens on our news at 9, and many people have begun to believe that's the only reality that exists. But poetry is a reminder that between all these ideas of right and wrong, between all these ideas of the good fight and the bad fight, us and them, we seem to have divided our world today into us and them. It's a very tribal approach, really, to reality. I think in such times, poetry is a wonderful reminder that these divisions that we create are really of our own making, and that there is another way to approach life, which is to acknowledge that it's possible to be gobsmacked and awed by reality. You don't necessarily have to have a conclusion about what you're seeing around you. Sometimes you may not even have an opinion, but you can still share wonder. So I think poetry is vital to our lives because it reminds us of wonder. And I think poetry is vital to our lives because it reminds us of the importance of sensuousness. You know, many people believe knowledge is just about a pursuit of ideas, as if ideas can in any way ever be separated from what it means to be human. Poetry brings us back time and time and again to the experience of being human. What does it mean to inhabit this body? It's not enough to just use words like love and God and freedom and justice and liberty. What do they actually mean? What is the texture of this experience? What is the taste of this experience? Poetry constantly anchors us in the sensory. And I think we need sensuousness in our lives very deeply today, particularly when we're leading this very disengaged world we're all inhabiting this disengaged world, Uday, in more ways than one. I mean, you're there in Ghaziabad and I'm here in Chennai, and here we are talking online, just talking into the ether, as it were. It's wonderful that we're able to do it, but I think we also need to constantly remind ourselves of the importance of the concrete, the particular, the local, and poetry reminds us of that. Poetry compels us to inhabit that.
Yes, great thoughts, ma'am. And now I would ask you about what are the elements that you find in a poem that makes it a good poem or a significant poem.
I'm always wary of sounding when I said talked about legislative criticism. I don't want to ever sound like these are the only ingredients of a poem, or this is what comprises a good poem. I always say that every time I define good poetry, I encounter some kind of verbal organism that challenges that definition. So I'm not going to give a definition, but I'll say some of the ingredients that for me that help make a verbal utterance compelling are metaphor or image. When an image is strong, language comes to life. Some of the other ingredients would include sound and attention to sound. When you speak of sound, you're talking about an utterance where the meaning is inseparable from the oral quality of it. That is, it is both the semantic aspect and the sound aspect are inextricable. The sound of a poem is crucial. Equally with sound, I'd say the tone of a poem. I often look for the tone in a poem. You know, what is the emotional or psychological axis of a poem? That is the tone for me. What is it trying? What is it saying? How is it saying it? And I also look for economy. That is, in a good poem, language is never used carelessly. Language is never flabby. A good poem is one where there is no flab. You can write a long poem, but not a flabby poem. Every word has to earn its place. So I'd say economy is also an ingredient in a poem. And finally, I'd say there has to be a sense of surprise, of unexpectedness in a poem. I read a poem, and when I go away from a poem, the poems that stay with me are those that, in some very subtle way, have altered the way in which I map the world. It could just be the fact that someone may write about a flea or a cockroach, as some poets have. And I remember those poems only because when I go away, it has in some subtle way changed the way in which I look at that cockroach. It has changed the way in which I look at a flea. It's changed the way in which I look at something. So that comes when there is something familiar and unfamiliar going on at the same time in a poem. There has to be surprise, there has to be suddenness, and at the same time, there needs to be the sense of recognition. So I always say a poem is one that needs to be surprising and inevitable at the same time.
Yes, ma'am. As you said, also you used to have a multiple drafts and revising your work. According to you, what is more important in a composition? Revising, reworking, and rethinking.
Which of these is more important? Is that what
Yes,
you're
ma'am.
asking?
Yeah. How?
Each one plays a role, doesn't it? Um, all of it goes together, Uday. You really can't. I mean, I'm all for reworking your draft. You may think you want to say something and you may think you've said it, but you have to keep going and tweaking the poem, fiddling around with it. Otherwise, you can always say it better than you've said it in your first draft, almost always. So to me, revising and reworking are very important. Rethinking, that means you're writing another poem altogether. So if I want to rethink the way I look at the idea of belonging, for instance, I'll have to write another whole series of books, another whole series of poems. Where I live dealt with one set of ideas about belonging. Now I'd have to write another book altogether if I wanted to explore it. So I'd say all of it is important. You know, you can't separate one from the other.
Yes, ma'am. You had did a lot work on spirituality. What role did spirituality had played in your life?
You know, spirituality, what do we mean by it? For me, it was really just, as I told you earlier, it was about having questions about living and dying and loss and pain, all of which I realized were just an inextricable part of life. So I had questions about those, and I think most of us do. You don't have to be terribly, any reasonably sensitive child has those questions. It's just that I stayed with those questions. I didn't let them go away. And those questions have periodically nudged me. And so they they unfolded for me a certain journey of quest. So I started looking for answers first in philosophy and deep reading of Eastern philosophy, as well as Eastern metaphysical poetry. Later on, I read the mystics, a lot of mystic literature, which I still continue to read. And still later, it led me to the need for guidance, personal guidance. And so I actually needed a spiritual guide and I needed a spiritual practice. And I think today I would say that actually having that spiritual practice, a daily practice. What do I mean by spiritual practice? I mean a daily non-verbal practice for myself. That's a consecrated practice that activates one's inner life in a certain way. I'm using the word nonverbal deliberately because I'm a person of words. My life has been about words. So having a practice that was unrelated to language was very important to me. And so that has been my pillar, my axis, that daily practice. And the guidance that I've received from actually having a spiritual guide and having met some very remarkable people whom I continue to meet.
Yes, ma'am. What are you reading in the present times?
What am I reading right now? I never read just one book, Uday. I'm always reading multiple books. So I'm reading Keki Daruwala, who's a poet I admire. He has a book of short stories out. So I've just started reading that book. It's called, I have it right here. It's called Going, Stories of Kinship. So I'd recommend that because we often think of Keki Daruwala as a poet, and he's a very fine poet. But it's interesting for me to read his short fiction because he writes very well. He's a very skilled writer of short fiction as well. So clearly a writer I'd recommend. The other book that I'm reading is a book that I'd also recommend strongly. It's called One Palace, A Thousand Doorways. And it's a book of poems in translation. It's called Song Lines Through Bhakti, Sufi, and Baul Oral Traditions by Vipul Rikhi and Shabnam Virmani. Oh gosh, here's the book. And I'd recommend it because it's mystic poetry, really. But the fact that they are musicians, I think, allows them to bring a certain musical cadence into their translations, which I've loved.
Yes, ma'am. Now, two small questions, and then we'll go for the poetry recitation. Uh, One is that what is your message to the children? What is your advice to the children of my age, which are not more inclined towards literature?
Thankfully, you are inclined with it. That's what gives me hope. But for those who aren't, I'd say, what does one say? That, we've already said why poetry is important. But for those who are even just a little inclined, I'd say this. What always interests me is that almost everyone, how old are you there? You're 15 or 14?
Ma'am,
14.
14, ma'am, 14.
14. So there's almost no one who's past the age of 14 and 15 without having written a poem. Everyone has written at least one poem. Uh, the strange thing, though, is that people write poems and then they put them away and they don't share them with anyone, or they share them with a few people. But the strange thing is that people who write poems don't necessarily read poems. I think this is what I'd say to younger people. Uh, Read. If you write poetry, you ought to be reading poetry too. And there are many people who come to me and say, read my poems. But it bothers me sometimes that they haven't. Do they really know why they're asking me to read their poems? Have they even bothered to read some of my work? And if they're not drawn to my work, that's absolutely fine. Whoever they are drawn to, whichever the poet is that they admire, it's important that you read their work and then go and share your work with them, because then their validation of your work matters. But this poetry alone, there is this odd thing about poetry that people write it, but they don't read it. So to all young people, I'd say read. Reading is crucial. It nourishes your practice of poetry as well. And the second thing I'd say is the world around you will keep telling you that other things count. Making money counts, livelihood counts, your bank balance counts, and it does. It does matter. You need to live responsibly, but make room for the non utilitarian. in your life as well. And poetry, literature, art, all these non-utilitarian aspects, you can't measure what you've gained from them. You can't ever measure. But what you gain is immeasurable. It's really immeasurable. And it transforms the person that you are. And just because it can't be quantified and measured doesn't mean it isn't important. It's hugely important.
Yes, ma'am. Now it's an honor for me to have a live recitation of poems. If you can do for something for us, some of your poems.
Is there any particular poem you want me to read?
Yes, some of I have marked also. If I can.
Mark? Then tell me what you'd like me to read.
So for, it's from your book that when
My
God
God
is a
is a
traveler.
traveler.
Page
I've
number
got
11. Plan page number 11. It is demand. That is one of my favorite poems.
Ah, okay. My gosh, I'll have to find the poem. Let me say that page numbers are not going to work here because I have an older edition of the book.
Okay,
But let
ma'am.
me, yeah, since I can't find demand right away, let me read a poem to friends, if that's all right, Uday.
Yeah, one of my favorites. I want to say that. Yeah. Please.
Okay. So this is a poem to friends, and I often say that it's an affectionate poem, but maybe all my friends don't necessarily see the affection, but it's intended to be an affectionate poem. My friends, they're sodden, the lot of them, leafy, with more than a whiff of damage, mottled with history, dark with grime. God knows, I've wanted them different, less preoccupied, more jaunty, less handled with care, more airbrushed, less prone to impossible dreams, less perishable, a little more willing to soak in the sun. They don't measure up, they're unpunctual, they turn suddenly tuberous, but they matter for their crooked smiles, their endless distractions, their sudden pauses, signs that they know how green stems twist and thicken as they vanish into the dark, making their way through their own sticky vernacular tissues of mud, improvising, blundering, improvising.
Fabulous, fabulous. It's give me goosebumps here, and surprisingly to hear you live.
Let me read you a poem that uses images from my school days, which is also from When God is a Traveler. You know, we live in times when everyone seems to have a political allegiance, and writing is, many writers are actually asked, what is your allegiance? What is the constituency that you belong to? And so one day I asked myself, who are my tribe? Where is my tribe? Where is my constituency? And I finally decided I'd found it when I wrote this poem. So these are my people. This is the group I belong to. This is my clan. And maybe just a few of you belong to the same one as well. I speak for those with orange lunchboxes. I speak for those with orange lunchboxes who play third tree in an orchard of 8 in the annual school play, who aren't head girls, games captains, class monitors, who watch other girls fight for the seesaw from the far wall across the sandpit, who remember everyone's lines but their own, who pelt after the school bus, their mother's breakfast still lurching in their gut, who still believe there'll be exams one day that they'll be ready for. Those with orange lunchboxes. I speak for them. Okay. Since we are still with the book, let me think of what else I can read. Maybe I should read you one from Love Without a Story, which is my most recent book. It's a small, very short poem called Parents. Parents, they vanish as abruptly as they appear, busy perfecting the art of truancy when they send you away to school. They cry wolf many times over, but when you turn for a moment, they melt away, velvet pawed, sure footed into the night.
Ma'am, two poems from this collection only. One is that Mitti, that you get the word, you told about that in the Bangalore Literature Festival also. And
Yes.
secondly, I want to hear that the anthem for the catabolic woman, if you can decide both of
Those are
them.
two long poems. I think you should choose one.
Yeah, Mitti, you can read them. Mitti.
Mitti? Okay, let's do Mitti. So Mitti was actually a poem that was actually suggested by a newspaper. I think it was the DNA that got in touch and asked some poets to write a poem using a word in an Indian language other than English. And each reader gave us a word. So the word that was assigned to me was mitti. And I was very excited about the idea, but when I saw the word mitti, I was actually a little apprehensive with it because I thought I was, being asked to write some Desh Ki Dharti type of poem. I didn't want to write a bunch of cliches. So I was a little, I had my misgivings about the word. But I stayed with the word and just allowed it to lead me to certain places. And eventually I found that the poem that unfolded was for me important because it was a way for me to think about ideas of belonging, of diversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, and just what it meant to be, just the idea of what this texture of mud means to us. So, for those who speak other languages, I should say mitti means mud, and particularly today when we are talking about the planet in the throes of a major environmental crisis, I think it's a poem I'm glad to be sharing. Mitti. As a child, I ate mud. It tasted of grit and peat and wild churning and something else that I could never quite find a name for. Later, I became a moon gazer, always squinting through windows, believing freedom was aerial, until I figured that the moon was a likely mud gazer, longing for the thick sludge of gravity, the promiscuous thrill of touch, the license to make, to break, to remake. And so I uncovered the old language of poets, to be messengers between moon and mud. And I began to uncover the many languages of earth that have nothing to do with nations and atlases, and everything to do with the ways of earwigs, the pilgrim trail of roots, the longing of life to hold and be held, and the irrepressible human love of naming. Ooze, mire, manure, humus, dirt, silt, mold, loam, soil, slush, clay, shit, manne, matope, baro, tinen, ni, luto, fango, all have their place, I found, in the democracy of tongues. None superior, none untranslatable, all reminders of the anthem of muck of which we are made. Except when June clouds capsize over an Arabian sea and a sleeping city awakens to an ache so singular that for just a moment it could have no name other than that where sound meets scent and a slop of matter meets a slick lunatic wetness. Mitti. Just that. Nothing else will do. There you go.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Fabulous poems they were, and fabulous recitation. And it's honor for me and for my listeners to listen you live. At last, I would request you to recite one of your poems of your favorite poet.
I have many favorite poets. And so when you mentioned this as a possibility earlier today, I was thinking of all the poets I'd love to read, from the Zen poets I've loved to Keki Daruwala, whom I talked about just a little while ago, Arun Kolatkar, A.K. Ramanujan. There are many. But what I'm going to do today is to actually read a short poem by the 13th century woman mystic Janabai. She's a Marathi woman mystic. And she's translated here by Arun Kolatkar, who's a very, very fine poet in his own right. And here's the poem that actually gave rise to the title of my book, since you asked of that about titles. The title of my book of Bhakti poetry, it was an anthology. It's called Eating God. And that's because so many of the poets, of the most interesting poets, actually spoke of the appetite for the divine, a need to devour God. And here's Janabai, the 13th century mystic, speaking here in a translation by Arun Kolatkar, who says the same thing. I eat God. I drink God. I sleep on God. I buy God. I count God. I deal with God. God is here. God is there. Void is not devoid of God. God is within. God is without. And what's more, there's God to spare. That's the poem. I love its jauntiness and its casual celebration of the sacred, Uday. The feeling that the sacred is everywhere.
Yes, ma'am. We would end with this. I just need a small and brief your views that you want to express to the young poets, budding writers, and who are in the curiosity to be a good poet or to write poetry. What you want to say to them?
I would say to them, don't listen to all those who tell you that it's not a worthwhile thing to do, that you ought to be doing something else, something more, as I said earlier, something more utilitarian, something more lucrative. If this is really what you want to do, make sure you carve out time for it. Poetry is not a career. This is something I would like to say. If you're looking for a career, go and do something else. Poetry, it has to be a passion. Poetry has to be a vocation. I never made a living off poetry. I made sure I did other things to make a living, but poetry was always central to my life. So I'm a little apprehensive sometimes when I encounter a careerist approach to poetry. What's in it for me? How many books have I published? How many awards have I received? That's necessary for your biodata. But really, the essence of being a poet is about the joy of hanging around words, the joy of hanging around uh, rhythms, verbal rhythms. That's the joy of poetry. It's not, it's sometimes bothers me when I hear people talk, when people introduce themselves as poets and then constantly just talk to each other about the festivals they've attended and the awards they've won. That's really the superficial aspect of being a poet. Much more fundamental is what is the magic by which words come together and become this living, breathing organism that you want to then share with someone else. And when you read a poem, it doesn't have to be a poem you've made. When you read a poem, what is it that excites you? Why do you want to keep going back to it? This was the great intelligence, this great ear for rhythm and sound and meaning is what gave rise to some of the greatest poetry on this planet. Also the great traditions of the mantra that we have in the subcontinent. What was it? What was the understanding? What was the alchemy at work? If you are curious about those questions, then I think deepen them, stay with them. And the most important thing I'd say to young people is read, write, don't listen to all the naysayers, but most importantly, don't be in a hurry to arrive. There is no arriving anyway. But don't be in a hurry to publish that first book. Don't be in a hurry to call yourself a poet. Really, the whole journey is about making poems. It's about creating poetry. It's not about taking on a noun. It's about being with the verb, the making of poems, the reading of poems. That's what's important.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Again, at the end, this is a very motivating thing that you have said to the young writers. Really, it was a master class for the young people, individually for me. And thank you so much again to you for joining.
Thank you there. I'm particularly glad I agreed because it's turned out to be a conversation that was much richer and much more varied than I ever imagined it would be. And that's thanks to your reading of the books and your of the work. And I really do appreciate that. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.